You got to see what's happening. They all want to come back to Michigan and build cars again. You know why? Because of our tax and tariff policy.
The North American auto industry, the big three, are navigating a new era as they deal with the impact of President Trump's tariffs.
Now, General Motors and Stellantis are already feeling the impacts, and now we're waiting to hear from Ford. GM says its second quarter profits fell by $1 billion. Stellantis says it lost $2.7 billion in the first half of the year, partially due to tariffs.
Trump's protectionist tariffs were sold as the miracle cure for Detroit's decline. Yet instead of reviving the Motor City, they're pushing the entire American auto industry to the edge of collapse. A 25% blanket tariff imposed in the name of America First is projected to add a staggering $18 billion in extra costs for U.S. automakers in 2025 alone. The so-called Detroit Three, Ford, GM, and Stellantis are carrying nearly $42 billion of that burden themselves. A weight so heavy, it's forcing them to slash profit forecasts and rethink entire business models. What was supposed to shield American jobs is now triggering layoffs, frozen investments, and panic across supply chains. Even Detroit's own business leaders, like the regional chamber, warned this policy may be nothing more than the industrial equivalent of shooting yourself in the foot. And at the center of the storm stands Stellantis, the transatlantic giant once hailed as a pillar of Detroit's rebirth, now unraveling in plain sight. Sales are plunging, inventories piling up, and massive losses turning one of America's supposed champions into the symbol of an industry in crisis. So, here's the question no one in Washington dares to ask. If the company meant to anchor Detroit can't survive Trump's protectionism, how much longer before the entire American auto sector caves in? Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. And nowhere is this collapse more visible than in Stellantis. Once celebrated as the transatlantic pride of Detroit, the company has now become the single biggest casualty of Trump's tariff war. In just 6 months, it swung from a profit of $5.6 billion last year to a net loss of $2.3 billion, about $2.7 billion in the first half of 2025. The numbers are brutal. Tariffs alone have already drained $300 million from Stellantis' balance sheet, a direct hit that shows no sign of easing. Sales across North America plunged 25% in the second quarter, a collapse so sharp it forced the company to shut down plants in Mexico and Canada. That decision rippled straight back across the border with nearly 900 American workers suddenly out of a job. Even Stellantis' own leadership is bracing for the worst. CFO Doug Osterman has warned that the total financial damage for 2025 could climb to as high as $1.5 billion. A projection that turns investor anxiety into outright panic. What was supposed to be Detroit's comeback story is now unraveling into a global cautionary tale. If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. But Stellantis is only the most visible casualty. Beneath the surface, Trump's tariffs are tearing apart the very fabric of North America's once seamless supply chain. What used to be an integrated network of factories and cross-spur production lines is now splintering into chaos, leaving the entire region reeling. Imported steel and aluminum now face tariffs as high as 50%, with nearly 80% of those costs landing squarely on automakers. Vehicles assembled in Mexico and Canada are hit with layered duties that can push effective tax rates to nearly 50%, erasing the cost advantages that once justified cross-spur production. The fallout is especially stark in Canada, where the auto industry directly employs 125,000 workers and supports nearly 500,000 more through suppliers and logistics. The strain has been so severe that Prime Minister Mark Carney was forced to delay new electric vehicle regulations, an extraordinary concession that highlights just how much pressure Ottawa is under. Even Stellantis' chairman, John Elkann, has sounded the alarm. He warns that 4 million vehicles imported into the U.S. every year still escape domestic sourcing requirements, a loophole that could collapse under the weight of tariffs, further destabilizing a system already stretched to breaking point. And the consequences are no longer confined to balance sheets. They are spilling directly onto factory floors. When Stellantis shuttered plants in Mexico and Canada, the shock immediately rippled back into the United States. 5 American production sites tied to those facilities were thrown into disarray, leaving nearly 900 U.S. workers suddenly without jobs. In industrial towns already fragile from years of decline, the closures have translated into stalled paychecks, shuttered diners, and communities sliding into paralysis. Stellantis, which builds nearly 39% of its North American vehicles outside U.S. borders, has been hit hardest by the tariffs. But the pain doesn't stop there. GM has been forced into emergency overdrive, ramping up truck production in Indiana just to keep pace, while Ford now faces an added $4,900 in tariffs on every vehicle assembled domestically, a cost that ultimately lands on American families. Even luxury brands haven't escaped. Ferrari and other European automakers have already responded by raising sticker prices by 10%, sending a clear signal that no corner of the global auto market is immune from Washington's policies. What began as a nationalist crusade is now rewriting the economic map of entire towns, forcing workers and consumers alike to pay for a promise that was never delivered. The backlash hasn't stopped at America's borders. It has ignited fury among U.S. allies, turning long-standing friends into reluctant adversaries. Canada, once the bedrock of America's trade partnerships, has answered Washington's tariffs with its own countermeasures on U.S. cars, escalating a dispute already simmering over energy pipelines and agricultural quotas. A cross-border economy that once functioned like a single machine now resembles a battlefield of retaliations, each move sharpening the rift between Ottawa and Washington. Japan, too, is staring at catastrophe. Its auto exports, long treated as a pillar of economic growth, now face losses of up to $17 billion. This threat forces Tokyo to ask a question unthinkable just a few years ago. Can the world's third-largest economy continue to anchor its fortunes to a market increasingly defined by unpredictability? South Korea, reading the danger in real time, has already moved to blunt the blow. Seoul's $2 billion lifeline to its automakers is more than a financial shield. It is a political declaration that 340,000 jobs cannot be gambled away on America's experiment with tariffs. Europe, meanwhile, is standing on the edge of its own cliff. The specter of a 30% tariff on EU-made vehicles hangs over the continent like a guillotine, delayed but not diffused. From Berlin to Paris, industry associations are warning that Washington's policies amount to nothing less than betrayal. An attack from the very ally that once guaranteed their access to global markets. The outrage is not only economic, but existential. If the U.S. is willing to undercut its allies this aggressively, what does that say about the future of transatlantic cooperation? What began as a domestic gamble has spiraled into a geopolitical rupture. Nations that once locked arms with Washington to defend shared prosperity are now drawing up contingency plans, seeking alternative markets, and forging new trade alignments that deliberately exclude the United States. The message from Ottawa, Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels is unmistakable. Loyalty has its limits, and when survival is at stake, no alliance is immune from fracture. As Stellantis spirals downward, its Detroit rivals are hardly faring better. Ford and GM have been dragged into the same vortex of rising costs and mounting uncertainty, forced to improvise strategies that feel more like triage than long-term planning. GM has rushed to ramp up truck production in Indiana, hoping to offset losses from disrupted cross-border supply chains. Yet, even as it accelerates output, executives are warning that if tariffs persist, they may have no choice but to relocate plants altogether, an admission that undercuts the very promise of keeping jobs in America. Ford faces an equally brutal equation. With layers of tariffs stacked one on top of another, the company now shoulders an average of $8,641 in added costs for every imported vehicle. The financial pressure has already forced Detroit's automakers to slash ambitious EV investment plans and retreat back to the relative safety of pickup trucks and SUVs, the very opposite of the innovation narrative Washington claims to champion. Meanwhile, the anxiety is palpable on the ground. Unions across Michigan and Ohio warned that a new wave of unemployment is taking shape as companies quietly prepare for layoffs if relief doesn't arrive. Instead of securing the future of American manufacturing, Trump's tariffs are leaving even the biggest players scrambling for survival. What was marketed as a revival has instead become a straitjacket. Trump's America First trade doctrine promised to restore U.S. manufacturing dominance. Yet in practice, it has left the nation's auto industry boxed in, paying more for materials, losing ground abroad, and facing new layers of uncertainty at home. The rhetoric of national strength has curdled into a reality of industrial fragility. Credit agencies and global analysts are sounding the alarm. Moody's has singled out Volkswagen, Volvo, and Stellantis as the most exposed multinationals, their reliance on U.S. consumers turning from asset to liability in a matter of months. ING goes further, warning that Washington's retreat from electric vehicle incentives will not only stunt domestic growth, but could cement foreign leadership in one of the century's most critical technologies. Every dollar of subsidy cut is a dollar ceded to Seoul, Tokyo, or Berlin. The market consequences are already visible. Detroit's share of the global auto market has slid from 18% to below 12% in just 2 years. An erosion that cannot be explained away as a temporary cycle. The speed and scale point to something deeper, a structural loss of influence in a sector once synonymous with American power. In boardrooms across Europe and Asia, strategists now treat the United States not as a partner setting the rules, but as a stumbling competitor undermined by its own policies. Policy groups within the U.S. are equally blunt. Instead of calling these tariffs a shield, trade advocates now describe them as a direct strike at the very heart of American industry. The tariffs may protect a handful of jobs in the short term, but they also push innovation offshore, encourage allies to diversify away from U.S. supply chains, and fracture the credibility of Washington's economic leadership. What began as a bid to control America's destiny has become a trap, one that risks leaving the auto industry sidelined in the very global race it once dominated. What began as a domestic protectionist gamble has now spiraled into a global crisis. Instead of fueling a renaissance, Trump's tariff war has set the stage for an American auto recession. The dominoes keep falling outward. Canada, Europe, Japan, and South Korea, all longtime U.S. allies, are now redirecting their trade and industrial strategies toward alternative partners. And while Washington scrambles, Beijing barely flinches. With Chinese cars and parts already locked out by 100% tariffs, the country stands on the sidelines, watching its competitors bleed while its own markets shift towards self-reliance. The dream of Detroit reborn is evaporating. In its place rises a darker reality, an America surrendering market share not to rivals on the battlefield, but to rivals in the boardroom and the factory floor. The final question remains chilling if even Detroit, the heart of American industry, is collapsing under the weight of protectionism. What pillar of U.S. power can truly be considered safe? And that's the story. A policy meant to protect has instead exposed America's deepest vulnerabilities. Detroit is just the first crack. What comes next could decide the future of U.S. industry itself. Do you think this collapse is a temporary stumble or the beginning of a long-term decline? Thanks for sticking around. If you found this valuable, like and subscribe to support more content like this.